Blog Talk Radio.
Well, here we go, ladies and gentlemen, across this great country, and this is one of the classic shows in the network. It is the American Sports History Podcast, hosted by my good friend Peter Ray. Yours truly, Mark Mancini, producing. 347-205-9631. Without further ado, as I give him the podium, the mic, and the red carpet. Peter, first of all, how are you? Second of all, how can people get a hold of you? Third of all, it's a little Philly cheese steaks and Liberty Bells today, my friend.
Hi, Mark. I'm doing well. Doing very well. Thank you. I have a YouTube channel. It's my name, Peter J. Ray, R-E-A. I have a website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray. And tonight we have a wonderful guest, Matthew DiBiase, who has written a number of sports books, including Bench Bosses, the NHL's Coaching Elite in 2015, The Art of the Dealers, NHL's Greatest General Managers in 2017, and Lords of the Gridiron, College Football's Greatest Coaches in 2019. It's a real honor and privilege to have on the show Matthew DiBiase. Welcome to the show, Mr. DiBiase.
Thank you, Peter. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
And so now I've been reading your book, Lords of the Gridiron, and the thing that strikes me about it is that interests me in particular is the early history of football, which comes out in a number of these. You picked the 50 your opinion of the 50 greatest college football coaches, and I was doing I did a project, Cleveland baseball history. I made videos on every year of Cleveland baseball history going back to 1869. And if I have time, I'd like to do the same thing for Cleveland football. And based on what I've been able to tell, the first pro football team in Cleveland was the 1916 Cleveland Tigers, who played in the Ohio League. And actually, they were player coached by Peggy Parrott, who's buried in Cleveland, Lakeview Cemetery. Anyway, I've gone through these, and I'll give you a name, and you can just tell me whatever you want. First, I was impressed. I had no idea of Walter Camp, how much of a role he played in the development of American football, the line of scrimmage, for example, and downs. Would you like to talk about Walter Camp?
Yes, I mean, there is no single one father of football as we know it today. I mean, basically, American football as we know it was born out of soccer. I mean, soccer is the father of both British and Australian rugby and American football. What camp was before 1869, I mean, basically, it was just kicking the ball around. It was more like soccer in that sense. And there was also some rugby elements. You would, run it like rugby. But after 1869, what Camp did was he Americanized the game. And basically, by introducing the line of scrimmage, he introduced the concepts of offense and defense, whereas with soccer and rugby, there are no real lines between offense and defense. It's whoever's got the ball, as it were. But here, he created that concept of, only one side possessing the ball. Then he created a concept of downs. In other words, if you can advance the ball, 5 yards and 3 downs. Remember, there's no forward passing back then. You could maintain possession. But if you couldn't do it, then you would have to, give up possession in that sense. And then, as the game began to evolve, like you couldn't tackle below the hips in the early years. But then he said you could do that, so that helped improve defenses and all throughout. And he was such an influential presence. And Yale football was the strongest, most powerful college football program in all of America. During the first 40 years of college football. And he was the man. I mean, there was no such thing as head coaching in those days, but he was kind of like the man behind the scenes, always devising new plays, new concepts, and all that. So it all came from him because, like Amos Alonzo Stagg played for him. And Stagg influenced so many people like Knute Rockne. I mean, in a sense, I say it in the book, Walter Camp is Coach Zero. I mean, he influenced Amos Alonzo Stagg. He influenced Dr. Henry Williams. And he introduced, and as well as others. And they passed that knowledge along through generation to generation. I mean, you could go from like Dabo Sweeney and do a chain all the way back to Walter Camp, and I talk about that in the book. I mean, he was literally the father of American football.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I had no idea. You think of the line of scrimmage and downs, and everything has to start somewhere. And I had no idea this individual, Walter Camp. So that's such a wonderful thing that you're bringing to light. Because the NFL hasn't. I think there needs to be more work to really, bring out this. Especially with TV, there's been a tendency to glorify the Super Bowl era, or they'll say, okay, the NFL started in 1920, but what about all this pre-NFL American football? And it's just wonderful that you've shown some light on these very important people. I'll give you another name here, George Woodruff.
Yeah, Woodruff was also an acolyte of Walter Camp because he too played at Yale University. He was a lineman. He was. When they created the All-American ratings, was it 1889 or so? I think he was one of the first to earn All-American honors, and he created the concept of the guards back formation because back today we have the rule you must have 7 men on the line of scrimmage. You've got to have at least 7 men. And back then the rules were a lot more flexible. Back then you could have like 5 men or even 6 men, and what he did was, since there was no forward passing, he wanted to add greater strength to the ground game. So what he did was he took the 2 guards, instead of on the line of scrimmage, he put them in the backfield ahead of the fullbacks and the halfbacks. And what happened is once the ball was snapped, you would have 2 guards already leading interference, either going around right end or left end for whoever got the ball, the halfback or the fullback. And it was devastating in those days. I mean, they were just gaining yardage like hand over fist. And he literally put the Penn Quakers, University of Pennsylvania Quakers football team on the college football map. He won 2 national championships in 1895 and 1897. In fact, they were drawing so many people. Their stadium was not big enough, so they raised enough money through ticket sales to create what we now know and love as Franklin Field in Philadelphia, which is still the oldest active college football stadium in America.
Very interesting. Okay, Fred Folsom.
Fred Folsom is another obscure figure. He went to the University of Colorado in the 1890s. He basically put what is now the University of Colorado Golden Buffaloes, again, on the college football map. I mean, when he went there, the football team was only like 4 or 5 years old. And in fact, the university itself was founded in like 1876, the year that Colorado got statehood. So basically, it was only like, 14, 18 years old. He came from New England. He was born in Maine. Went to college at Dartmouth, and as soon as he got out of college, I mean, he was basically a college graduate in his mid-20s. He went to Colorado and just basically took over the football team, and in 3 separate stints of his life, he coached them because he would coach for a while, but he was a law student, and once he got his law degree, he wanted to practice law. And he would take time out, and work on his law practice and all that. But the thing was, he was so great a coach, the University of Colorado would plead for him, please come back, because his successors couldn't do squat. He had that secret. He could get the most out of his men. And in the beginning, Colorado was just a isolated university. Most of the time, maybe they might play 1 or 2 other colleges. Sometimes they would just play local athletic clubs. I mean, it was still a pioneer out there. It was still the frontier out there. But as the years got on, Western, college football in the West began to take hold, and they began to expand. And they were no longer just playing rivals within their own state. They were taking on, people like New Mexico, Nebraska, and by the time, and by 1910, they were getting more organized. And he quit for good. But they named Folsom Field after him because he was its greatest football coach until Bill McCartney came along. But he was just always there. I mean, after he quit coaching, he was a member of its a distinguished member of its law school. In fact, his descendants, his son was, I think, a diplomat or a top wheel in the U.S. Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and his grandson, Fred Folsom III, is a nationally renowned Washington, D.C. artist. I spoke to him and all of that. It was a very distinguished family, the Folsoms, and he basically put Colorado football on the map.
Okay, we're talking about the greatest college football coaches of all time. Here's another name for you, Pop Warner.
Glenn Pop Warner, along with Walter Camp and Amos Alonzo Stagg, probably the most innovative college football coach of all time. He created the single wing and the double wing formations, like precursors of the shotgun formation, but back then the emphasis was on running instead of passing. I mean, it was more oriented to running. What you would have was unbalanced lines. Instead of having the guards flanking the center, you might have two guards on the left side or on the right side, depending on where the ball was placed. And you could use a lot of reverses, a lot of ball trickery. If you had a tailback like Jim Thorpe or Ernie Nevers, who could a triple threat who could run, pass, and kick with superbly, like those two men did, the single wing and double wing formations were devastating. I mean, he's the man who coached Jim Thorpe, who was voted the greatest all-around athlete of the first half century, by the American press. And then he later coached Ernie Nevers at Stanford. I mean, Pop Warner coached Georgia, Cornell, Carlisle Indian Institute, where he coached Jim Thorpe. Later he went to Pitt. And he won 3 straight mythical national championships from 1916 to 1918. He coached at Stanford. He even coached at Temple University in Philadelphia there. But in terms of innovation, I mean, he took on Newt Rockne in the 1925 Rose Bowl and lost to him 27-10. I mean, he was an absolute legend. In fact, today he has the 4th most wins of all college Division I-A coaches.
Yeah, Pop Warner is familiar to me because of, you come across Jim Thorpe is such an important athlete in really world history. And I believe my father played Pop Warner youth football back in the 1930s. So
yes,
came up.
He didn't create the Pop Warner football program. He did not create it. But he gave a speech before the organization that created it, and they asked him, Mr. Warner, would you please lend your name to the program so that would help us raise funds? He gave his permission to do so. So although he didn't create the program, he allowed his name to be used as a tool that would help raise funds and attract kids to the program.
Oh, what a wonderful topic! American football history. Another one of the greatest college football coaches of all time, Henry Williams.
Dr. Henry Williams, and that wasn't an honorary title. He was a practicing physician. He too was a disciple of Walter Camp, and he played for Camp at Yale University, but he was more of a reserve player. But he too was innovative. He invented the tackle-back formation, where you literally took an offensive tackle and you put him in the backfield as a blocking back. Thus, and they had a special play, which is now we know it as the trap play. He created that concept of pulling a lineman out, creating a fake hole for the defenseman to brush through, and then slip the ball to the back, and then slip through the vacancy left by the defensive lineman. He coached at Army. But for a year, for the rest of the 1890s, he didn't coach at all. What he was completing his medical studies, and actually he was a licensed gynecologist. But football was his secondary love, and he was so good at it. The University of Minnesota asked him, "Would you please coach our football team?" And he agreed on the condition that he also teach and practice gynecology at the university and at Minnesota. And for 20-some years, he led the Minnesota Gophers program, and he was like Michigan's top rival and what is now the Big Ten, but back then was called the Western Conference. And it was under his guide that the Little Brown Jug rivalry developed because of a game that they played in 1904 that ended in a tie, 6-6, and Michigan left one of its wooden water jugs behind, and when Minnesota took possession of it, and they carved the game results, and that's where you get the Little Brown Jug from.
Fascinating. Okay, another one of the greatest college football coaches, Percy Haughton.
Percy Haughton was for a time. It's hard to believe now, but Harvard around 1910 to 1913 was the greatest football program in the country, and Percy Haughton was the man responsible for that. He played at Harvard in the 1890s, helped them win a game against Yale. He came from a very wealthy family. His father wanted him to work in the family business selling, I think was it financial securities or something like stocks and bonds and all that. But Haughton loves football. I mean, that was his real love. He loved playing in sports. He could play tennis. He could play golf and all that. But mostly it was football. He coached briefly at Cornell, but in 1908, Harvard had a real bad spot. They weren't doing so good at all. In fact, they kept losing to Yale in its famous rivalry, and they were sick and tired of it. And they wanted someone. What they needed was a full-time coach, because before that they didn't have a full-time coach. But they did was use team captains to devise the strategy. But now they really needed, a fully professional football coach, and they reached out to Haughton. And what he did was he created what we now take for granted in terms of organization. Back then, before he came along, a coach might have one assistant, maybe, and all. It was no bureaucracy at all. It was Haughton who literally created the concept of football bureaucracy. You got a backfield coach, you got an offensive line coach, you got a defensive line coach, you got a coach taking care of the ends and all that. You got scouts. He created the game of pre-game scouting and all that. Literally a bureaucracy, a football bureaucracy. That when you look at any major college football program today, like Alabama, it's a massive Byzantine structure. But he's the one who created the concept of organization and coaching structure and all that. In other words, specialized coaches to teach offensive line play, backfield play, defensive play, whatever, kicking and all that. As specialists. And
during the coaches. Go ahead. Sorry.
And a lot of coaches took advice from that. Rockne was influenced by that. General Bob Nealon, the great Tennessee coach, learned organization from him. A lot of coaches were inspired by that concept of organization, discipline, and that is his great impact in college football.
During the days when the Harvard-Yale was the football rivalry.
Yeah. I mean, some of his defeats. One year he beat Yale 41-0. One year he beat them 36-0. And to this day, they are the worst shellackings Yale ever experienced during that famous rivalry there.
Okay, another one of the greatest college football coaches of all time, Fielding Yost.
Hurry up, Yost. Oh, wow. Yeah, in fact, a few days ago was like the anniversary of his death. He died August 20th, 1946. Fielding Hurry Up Yost literally put Michigan on the college football map. I mean, Michigan football predated his arrival in 1901. But what Yost did with his hurry-up strategy, I mean, he literally created what we now know as the hurry-up offense, because there was no huddle back then. As soon as a play was whistled dead, he drilled his men so relentlessly they could get up. The quarterback would start barking out the signals immediately as the men were quickly forming in the lines, and the defense, the opposing teams, were just barely getting themselves in the defense, and they would snap the play off and catch the opponents flat-footed. They would win. Like one game, they beat an opponent 128-0, because they were literally scoring a point a minute. I mean, a full 60 minutes of football, and they were winning scores like 84-0, 60-0. I mean, they were just racking up like crazy. And for four straight years, they never lost a game. They only had one tie in 2004, and their unbeaten streak ended literally on the last game of 1905 when they lost to Chicago 2-0. But I mean, Yost had men like Willie. He was the greatest coach of the 1900s, according to my rating system. And he, too, was vastly influential. He had this concept of a punt, pass, and a prayer. Basically, what he did was he used his defense. He would always use his defense to force the opposing team to commit a mistake, a turnover, a fumble, or a block kick, and finally, when forward passing was legalized, an interception, then get the ball deep in the enemy's territory and then go for the quick score. And if you couldn't get the touchdown, then he always had strong kicking teams, both field goal kicking and punting. You could get a field goal. But if he himself had very poor field position, he would just punt on first down and keep punting until he had very good field position or force the turnover. And he, from 1901 to 1926, with a 1 or 2 year gap, he coached Michigan. And by my calculations, when he returned in 1926, he was the greatest college football coach of all time until he was surpassed by Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, Tom Osborne, Bear Bryant, and Bud Wilkinson and all of that. But for 1926, he was the greatest of his time.
Now, the origin of the hurry-up offense.
Yes. I mean, they ran at breakneck speed. I mean, and he drilled them. They were so well conditioned. I mean, he drilled them because that's where he got the name Hurry Up. He would keep telling his men, hurry up, come on, move, run it off. And they would move like gangbusters, and get the plays off. And they could just move like that. So, I mean, literally it was a hurry-up offense. And this was the pre-forward pass era.
Another one of the greatest college football coaches of all time, Andy Smith.
Andy Smith, a very rare and obscure figure, but for a wonderful 5-year time period from 1920 to 1924. In a few weeks we'll be coming up on the centennial of when he started his wonder teams. The University of California at Berkeley had the greatest football team in the Western United States, and in the eyes of some retroactive organizations, he was named national champion a couple times, definitely in 1920 and in 1921, his teams. And they were devastating. I mean, they had a perfect team 100 years ago. They beat Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. He shut them out. In fact, it was like over a century before Ohio State ever got shut out in a bowl game ever again. I mean, but they annihilated them 28-0. And he went to California and basically took the team over from scratch. They had discontinued football, but when he took over in 1916, they had revived the football program, and basically he combed all the high schools in California area, got all these top high school kids, drilled them relentlessly, using a good razzle-dazzle offense and a devastating defense, and they just annihilated everyone. I mean, what is now the Pac-12 just came into being in 1916, and during those early years, they dominated what that was called the Pacific Coast Conference. And it wasn't until 1924 that they finally lost that domination, ironically to Pop Warner's Stanford University teams. But
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah, continue. Yeah.
Charlie Moran.
Uncle Charlie. Okay, don't laugh. Next year will be the centennial of his great upset victory of Centre College over Harvard University. But today I went to Centre College. It's this quiet little liberal arts college in Danville, Kentucky. Just quiet little out of the way place. But 100 years ago, they decided they wanted to build up their football program. They got Charlie Moran, who had coached at Texas A&M and had done great work there. And he was living at nearby Horse Cave, which is a town close to Danville, and his son was going to Centre. And the president of the university wanted to really revamp the football program. He had recruited these stud athletes from Texas to play at Centre, but he needed a coach. And Charlie Moran would just happen to be there. He said, maybe I can help out. Maybe I can advise the head coach. And the president said, no, I don't want you as an advisor. I want you to be the head coach. And he took over. And they were taking on not just small universities. They were taking on big guys. They took on Harvard in 1920, lost to them, but they said, we want a rematch. And the following year, they took them on, and they beat them 6-0. And it was one of the great upsets in college football history during the first half of the 20th century. I mean, today, Centre, I think, is like a Division III football program. So imagine a Division III champion taking on national champion LSU, for all the marbles and all that. But today it wouldn't happen, but back then it was possible, and it made history. I mean, Bo McMillan scored the lone touchdown 6-0 because he was the all-around tailback for Centre, and he made his living off that play and all that. It made him world famous, and And he was incredible, Moran. He was also an umpire in the National League because he umpired there.
Dana
Yeah.
X Bible.
DX Bible, another early influential figure. He too put Texas college football on the college football map. I mean, they had football teams, but he was the one who got national attention with his work, first at Texas A&M and then later at Texas. In fact, he's the only man ever to coach the Texas A&M Aggies football team and the Texas Longhorns football team. No one else has ever done that. And he was also a defensive maven. In fact, he learned defense from Hurry Up Yost and Amos Alonzo Stagg. And he was in 1919. According to some retroactive organizations, he won what they deemed as a mythical national championship. They didn't have the AP polls back then. That didn't start until 1936. But there are some organizations that do like retroactive research to determine, okay, who would have been a national champion? And they did. Some organizations deem Bible's 1919 A&M team as a national champion. And he put Texas football on the map. People started paying, oh, wow, they play good football there. And he was like an early power in what is the now defunct Southwest Conference there. And he coached in Nebraska. And then the Texas Longhorns were desperate to rebuild their program, and they reached out to Bible, will you please come back to Texas and revive our program? He agreed to do so. He coached Bobby Lane and Tom Landry. He was their head coach.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah.
Newt Rockne.
Newt Rockne. I mean, I know it's a surprise in my book that I don't have among the top 10, but the reason for that was that his career was just too short. He couldn't have accumulated enough career coaching value to equal that with, Saban, Bear Bryant, Bud Wilkinson, and the others. And also the fact that Notre Dame only played one bowl game kind of told against him because he couldn't add extra points by playing bowl games. Because after the 1925 Rose Bowl, the University of Notre Dame went to Rockne and said, we really don't want to do bowl games again. We are an academic institution first and a football program second. So I don't want you accepting any more invitations to the Rose Bowl. And Rockne agreed to that. So even though he had some great teams in like 29 and 30 that were deemed national champions, they didn't play in the Rose Bowl, though. And so that was his only bowl game appearance. But he, too, his impact is felt even today because so many of his players became coaches in their head on their own right, like Jim Crowley of the Four Horsemen, Frank Leahy, and Buck Shaw, who coached the Eagles to 1960 NFL title. So many men became coaches, and through them, his influence extended out. You could say Vince Lombardi was a product of the Newt Rockne coaching tree because who was his coach in college? Sleepy Jim Crowley and Frank Leahy. And so you could say, Lombardi was a descendant of the Newt Rockne school, as it were. And Rockne, as an orator, he was the first college football coach to have a movie bio made of him. Newt Rockne, All-American and all of that. No one other coach had been a subject of a movie biography. That's the one where Ronald Reagan says, win one for the Gipper and all that. And hey, why do we remember that phrase? It's Newt Rockne. He said, win one for the Gipper. He was probably the most famous and most greatest locker room orator in college football, all of football history.
Yeah, that's one of the great lines. Yeah, we had to make time for Newt Rockne, especially that famous line, win one for the Gipper. The dying words of George Gipp. Newt Rockne, Ronald Reagan, who became president in 1980. Yeah. Well, we are out of time. Mr. Matthew DiBiase, any final words for our audience?
Yes, if you're looking for my book, Lords of the Gridiron, College Football's Greatest Coaches, you can buy it at Amazon. It's not available in stores. You have to go online and get it. Just type in Lords of the Gridiron, College Football's Greatest Coaches, and you will find the book on Amazon. Or type in my name, Matthew DiBiase, DiBiase, and you'll get it. And in fact, in a couple of days, it's going to be on sale at 30% off for the rest of this year, okay? So if you're looking for an early Christmas present, go out and get it, okay?
Well, I commend you for your efforts, and especially because this is something dear to my heart, is early history of American sports, and in this case football, which, yeah, I think baseball is people know a lot better, but the early history better, but football not really. So this is I commend you for your efforts, Mr. DiBiase.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Well, dear listener, next week our guest will be Bobby Hallback, mental health coach for the Miami in Miami, Florida. Dear listener, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, and winds fall. I can't forget this. May the road rise to meet you. May the winds be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Good night, everybody.
Thanks.